Well, there is a question I get pretty commonly ever since I started this channel, and even in Corey Loses, my gaming channel, where people may watch a lot of lore videos, but they're a bit daunted by the prospect of starting to read Star Wars books themselves, or comic books, or even getting into some video games, or whatever the case may be. So I wanted to do a quick video to talk about my recommendations on where people should and in some places shouldn't get started with the expanded universe. I will start off by saying that there isn't really a horrible place to go. There are some that in my opinion, are better than others. But if you really want to get into it, it's not like you're always going to need a huge amount of background information for everything. When I first started reading Star Wars Expanded Universe novels, one of the first ones that I read was Star by Star by Troy Denning, which is book like 14 or 15 in the Yuzan Vong War or the New Jedi Order series. So there was a lot I was missing, and I was still able to get into it okay. So don't worry about it too much, but there are a few places I'd suggest starting and not starting. My first recommendation would be to not get into anything post Endor as a starting point after the Yuzan Vong War starts. So don't start off with New Jedi Order, Dark Nest, Legacy of the Force, or Fate of the Jedi, or even really the Legacy comics if you want to get in with comics, because that is where Star Wars tended to get more into longer direct narratives built around newer characters, especially. There's a lot more character development that has happened up to that point. So if you're looking for like an adventure with Han, Luke, and Leia, you're going to find them, but they're going to be a lot has gone on for them. So it does require a bit more of a basis, or there's some stuff that you may not get the references to as easily. But I think the most common recommendation you're going to get started in either the new canon or Legends is with the Thrawn Trilogy. So there's the original Thrawn Trilogy, which was kind of the thing that kickstarted the expanded universe back into action with Heir to the Empire, Dark Force Rising, and Last Command. Because those came out, there wasn't much else that they had to reference. They heavily involved movie characters, and they introduced a lot of characters like Mara Jade and Talon Karrde, who are going to become a lot more prominent in other future books. So it's a great place to start. It doesn't necessarily assume that you've read anything between Endor and the Thrawn Trilogy, which does take place about 5 years later, and so there's other books that happen in the meantime. But again, nothing that it assumes you've read, because a lot of those things weren't even written yet. So it'd be difficult for them to build on it too much. Another thing in that kind of area is the X-Wing series, which is another great starting point. It was written a bit after the Thrawn Trilogy, but it's set before. The downside there is that it's pretty much all new characters, except for a few like Wedge, who's in the movies, obviously, but you don't get a lot of time with them in the movies. So for all intents and purposes, you're dealing with new characters. You get some appearances by some of the movie characters that tie it in really well, but if you're just looking for something that's a bit more like continuing the movies and those characters as a starting point, then Thrawn Trilogy is probably going to edge out the X-Wing series. But either one, in my opinion, is a good place to start. You'd also want to avoid stuff, I think, that is set after Dark Empire. So like the Corellian Trilogy, the Hand of Thrawn duology, Darksaber, because while these, in my opinion, are typically pretty good, they do tend to rely a lot on stuff that has happened earlier. Some of it with Dark Empire, some of it just being more about Imperial warlords and some other events that have happened already, and a lot of involvement from some of the newer characters I was talking about, like Mara, who you'd be better off getting introduced through the Thrawn Trilogy, because the Thrawn Trilogy is kind of like the formative work of that kind of period. If you're looking to get involved with comics as well, the Thrawn Trilogy is another great place to start there, because there was a comic book adaptation that was made with it. Probably the most famous comics that you're going to hear about would be Dark Empire, but there's a different sort of tone to that, that like they're still worth reading at some point, but as someone who's just trying to get into it, it may be a bit off-putting going in straight to Dark Empire. It's not really what a lot of people might expect getting into it. And it's kind of the same thing with the Marvel Star Wars comics, where they were one of the earliest bits of expanded universe. But again, it's a very different kind of tone, and it's something The Marvel comics in particular don't tie together quite as well as some of the other stuff from Dark Horse later, who made the Dark Empire comics and also a lot of the adaptations, and Bantam Spectra, who published a lot of the early novels before Del Rey took over the license. So yeah, if you're trying to get involved in Star Wars Expanded Universe material post Endor, my recommendations, and I think most people's recommendations, would be the X-Wing series and the Thrawn Trilogy. There's a couple other one-off books like Courtship of Princess Leia and Truce of Bakura, where I don't think they're quite as strong as the Thrawn Trilogy or X-Wing, but they take place either right after Endor with Truce of Bakura, so it picks up right where Episode 6 leaves off, or Courtship, which again is heavily involving characters from the movies and doesn't assume a whole lot of knowledge from stuff like the Thrawn Trilogy. But yeah, so that would be my recommendations for comic books and books starting at that point. I'm not super familiar with comics in other eras. There's like some Knights of the Old Republic comics, Legacy era comics, Knights of the Old Republic comics. You don't need a huge amount of knowledge, of course. It's just if you really want to see a bunch of Jedi doing stuff, that time period might be what you're looking for. But again, it's not going to tie as much into stuff you're already familiar with from the movies. Maybe if you played Knights of the Old Republic, the video game, that could be an interesting place to jump in. But for the Clone Wars, I think there are a few standalone novels that do pretty well, like Labyrinth of Evil. In general, I wouldn't suggest in any period people start off with a book by James Luceno. He is one of the best Star Wars Expanded Universe authors, and he has some of the deepest Star Wars lore knowledge of any of the authors in Star Wars. His stuff tends to connect most to other books that people have put out, and that's one of the reasons I love them. But if you're just trying to get into it, I don't think it's a good place to start. Like Darth Plagueis is one of my favorite Star Wars books, but it's so reliant on other information and kind of like references other stuff going on that if you're going to read it, I'd kind of recommend reading it after you've read some other stuff so you can pick up on some of those a bit more, which is a lot of the fun with his books. You're not going to hate it if you haven't seen that stuff. It's just that's how I think you can appreciate it the most, or how you get the most out of it. So there's also a bit of potential to get a bit lost if you are not familiar with those things. But if you're looking for a series that is kind of just like straight up Clone Wars, the Republic Commando book series is actually a pretty good one to get into that way. In any universe that Karen Traviss, the author of that, is involved in, there's going to be some controversy around her just because there are some people who don't like how she handles Mandalorian. She does make them very powerful. And then there's some stuff in Halo that has not pleased parts of the fan base. But leaving that aside, I do think they're very accessible for people trying to get into it. And again, this isn't supposed to be like my top 10 Star Wars Legends books or whatever. These are just the places that I think it's easiest to get in, get some solid fun out of it, and move on from there. So for that purpose in the Clone Wars, I think the best two series you can get into would be the Republic Commando and MedStar Duology. Both are good for their own reasons. MedStar, it's more of like a MASH in Star Wars kind of situation, so it's just dealing with the doctors. There's not as much like combat or action and very few appearances from movie characters, but same kind of thing with Republic Commando. But they do give you a good idea of what the period's kind of about, and they don't necessarily rely too much on having outside knowledge other than what the Clone Wars related movies have. So episode 2 and 3 really is all you need to have for context there. The further back you go and the further forward you go, the harder it gets because there's so much that's just building off other comic books and novels. So those are kind of where I recommend starting, in the Clone Wars with some of that I mentioned, or post Endor with some of what I mentioned with the Thrawn Trilogy. There's also books like Death Star, which again, very referential, but you should be able to follow them pretty easily. And again, there's not a lot that you're going to completely miss out on by reading them out of order, but or starting at any particular point. But I'm just trying to suggest things that have a lot of through lines with the movies, or have a tone that matches with the movies, or gives you a good setup for the rest of what's going to happen. So James Luceno, again, is one who really good, but a lot more referential, but it's also built heavily off of the movies. So there's positives and negatives to that as well. But hopefully this has helped some of you. Again, it's a question I get quite a lot. If you are watching this and you have some experience yourself with reading Star Wars books and you want to leave some recommendations for people in the comments, please do that as well. But yeah, so thanks for watching. Hope it helped, and hope to see you next time. Bye.